This peripheral nervous system highlights screencast considers the division of the nervous system into a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. Although there is only one nervous system, it is sometimes convenient to subdivide it into a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, which are housed within the cranium and the vertebral canal. Histologically, the optic nerve and retina are also part of the central nervous system because they develop embryologically from the brain. But typically, the optic nerve is regarded as a cranial nerve of the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system consists of cranial and spinal nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves which attach to the brain, and there are 36 pairs of spinal nerves in the dog and cat which attach to the spinal cord. The spinal nerves are located within the vertebral canal, and they exit the canal through intervertebral foramina. There are 8 cervical, 13 thoracic, 7 lumbar, 3 sacral, and 5 caudal spinal nerve pairs. In general, there is a spinal nerve for each vertebra, except that the cervical region has an extra 8th pair of cervical spinal nerves, and there are only 5 caudal spinal nerves. This schematic image shows the canine nervous system. The brain and spinal cord, which are colored yellow, are the components of the central nervous system. The peripheral nerves are shown in black. The cranial nerves innervate the head. The spinal nerves innervate the rest of the body. Notice that both limbs are innervated by a nerve plexus. The brachial plexus supplies the thoracic limb, and the lumbosacral plexus supplies the pelvic limb. This image shows the spinal cord and spinal roots within the vertebral canal. The spinal cord has been exposed by a laminectomy, which removes the roofs of the vertebral arches, the roof being known as the lamina. The spinal cord is colored pale yellow, and it is divided into various segments. The pairs of spinal nerves given off from each segment are colored dark yellow. The spinal nerves are located more or less within intervertebral foramina formed by adjacent vertebrae. The spinal nerves are attached to the spinal cord by spinal roots. Each root is composed of rootlets. Each dorsal root has an enlargement called a spinal ganglion. The spinal cord and the spinal roots are enveloped by meninges, which have been removed except along the right side where the dura mater colored blue. The spinal cord is central nervous system. The spinal roots and the spinal nerves are peripheral nervous system. Components of the peripheral nervous system are nerves, roots, and 2 kinds of ganglia, spinal ganglia and autonomic ganglia. The remaining portion of the screencast will be devoted to defining these terms. A nerve consists of typically thousands of nerve fibers collected into bundles that are enveloped by connective tissue that is designated epineurium, perineurium, and endoneurium. Each nerve fiber consists of an axon sheathed by neurolemocyte supporting cells. Some of the supporting neurolemocytes produce myelin. This cartoon illustrates the components of a peripheral nerve. 2 myelinated axons are drawn. One is an afferent axon that has a receptor out at the periphery and conveys information to the central nervous system. The other is a somatic efferent axon that triggers skeletal muscle to contract. Both axons are within a nerve fascicle that contains hundreds of axons. Each fascicle, outlined in purple here, will eventually become a branch of a nerve. Within the fascicle, individual axons are ensheathed by neurolemmacytes. In this case, the neurolemmacytes are forming myelin. Connective tissue, called epineurium, drawn in blue here, surrounds the collection of nerve fascicles that comprise the nerve. Each fascicle is surrounded by a fibrous perineurium, and inside of the fascicle, small amounts of endoneurium connective tissue are evident. Each fascicle is lined by layers of flattened fibrocytes called perineural epithelioid cells or perineural epithelium. This lining is shown in purple. The epithelial cells constitute a barrier that protects the ionic composition for the individual axons within the nerve fascicle. The term root refers to axon bundles that are enveloped by meninges rather than epineurium perineurium. Roots connect cranial nerves to the brain and spinal nerves to the spinal cord. This image shows the spinal cord within the vertebral canal. The top of the canal, the roof of the canal, is called a lamina. Bilaterally, dorsal and ventral spinal roots run between the spinal cord and the spinal nerve, colored yellow. The spinal roots and the spinal cord are enveloped by meninges, colored in blue, including this here. Meninges are removed on this side. The dorsal root contains a spinal ganglion enlargement. The axons within the dorsal root will run into the spinal cord, and the axons in the ventral root will come out of the spinal cord. This image shows a segment of equine spinal cord giving rise to bilateral spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are formed by the union of dorsal and ventral spinal roots. Each root is composed of rootlets, and a spinal ganglion marked in red here and here is evident on the dorsal root. The spinal cord and the spinal roots are enveloped by meninges. This is duramatta, the edge of duramatta that has been cut and reflected to expose the cord and roots covered by other meninges. The axon bundles within the spinal nerve will be enveloped by perineurium, epineurium connective tissue rather than meninges like the roots and spinal cord. The term ganglion refers to an enlargement on a nerve or on a root produced by a collection of neuron cell bodies. There are two types of ganglia. Spinal ganglia are found on dorsal roots, and they contain unipolar cell bodies associated with afferent axons. Similar ganglia are associated with some cranial nerves. Autonomic ganglia are scattered along visceral nerves. They contain multipolar postganglionic neuron cell bodies that receive synapses from preganglionic autonomic neurons. This cartoon shows bilateral spinal nerves connected to the spinal cord by dorsal and ventral roots. A spinal ganglion, which contains unipolar cell bodies, is present on the dorsal root. Recall that unipolar cell bodies are associated with afferent axons. Axons are segregated in the roots. The dorsal root contains only afferent axons, which enter the spinal cord. Meanwhile, the ventral root contains efferent axons that leave the spinal cord. This image shows unipolar cell bodies within a spinal ganglion. The cell bodies are surrounded by satellite neurolemmacyte cells indicated by the white arrows. Cell bodies produce a ganglionic enlargement because they are so voluminous compared to the myelinated axons that normally populate a particular nerve or root. This cartoon shows two autonomic ganglia. This is the cervicothoracic ganglion, and this is the middle cervical ganglion. The autonomic ganglia contain multipolar postganglionic neurons that receive synapses from preganglionic autonomic neurons. This dissection image shows the actual cervical thoracic ganglion and middle cervical ganglion in the dog. The thousands of axons that comprise the peripheral nervous system belong to one of 6 fiber types. There are 2 efferent fiber types. Somatic efferent fibers innervate skeletal muscle. Visceral efferent axons, which are components of the autonomic nervous system, are ones that innervate cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and gland. Here, autonomic is misspelled. There should not be an I in the word. On the afferent side, general afferents have individual receptors at peripheral ends of their axons. Somatic afferents are associated with skin, muscle, tendons, and joints. Visceral afferents are associated with viscera. In cranial nerves, we see special afferents, which are associated with sense organs. This concludes our peripheral nervous system highlights screencast dealing with the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system.